Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and the Press, and I want to welcome you to the President Provost Readers Meet the Author event in the library. And to me, what better place to have an engagement on what's between the pages, in the place where we have pages both you can still touch, and most of our new pages are all digital, so you're just swiping across the screen. But it's important that we have these kind of events in the library so that we have an opportunity to engage with the ideas and what's inside the book. And before I hand this over to Dr. Brickhouse, I do want to read our land acknowledgement. And I ask that you not only think about the first part where we are acknowledging histories in our places, but also where has Baylor scoped sort of our commitment to working with indigenous communities. We respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus and Independence are on the land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipan-Apache. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization and American expansionism. In recognition that these Native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus location, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnership, and community service. Dr. Brickhouse.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here today. This is one of my very favorite events. It's when I get to learn more about the work of the faculty and engage with them in conversation about some of their most significant work. This series focuses on new works by Baylor faculty, single-authored, monograph-length works of scholarship. And so I'm really, really pleased today that we're having a conversation about David Bridges' book on Pushback, the political fallout of unpopular Supreme Court decisions. I can't imagine a hotter topic for today. So I am really looking forward to how you tiptoe through these tulips. But appreciate all of y'all being here as well. I do want to introduce both the author as well as the interviewer today, for those of you who may not know them as well. Dr. Dave Bridge is an associate professor of political science and, of course, the author of today's volume. He holds a PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Southern California, and he's been teaching at Baylor since 2010. He studies, obviously, American politics, with a special emphasis on the Supreme Court and how it relates to other branches, to the political parties, and to elections. He teaches courses on the U.S. Constitution. Yes, I remember my course on the U.S. Constitution as a Baylor student in 1980. It is distinctive. It is a distinctive feature of Baylor University, and one that I think is actually quite interesting and important. Anyway, he not only teaches courses on the U.S. Constitution, campaigns and elections, and Black politics, he's also really good at it. He's won a number of teaching awards, including the Outstanding Tenure Teaching Award in 22-23. And in 22, he received the Core Curriculum Virtues Recognition Award for his effort to facilitate the development of the virtue of respect in his Constitution course. Thank you. Dean Jeremy Counseller is the dean of Baylor Law School. He's still new, sort of. We've only got a few more months to count as new, so just so you know, the clock is ticking. And he's also the Abner V. McCall Chair of Evidence Law. He graduated with honors from Baylor Law in 2000 and served as a law clerk for the Honorable Ronaldo G. Garza of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He worked as a trial attorney with Bracewell and Patterson, LLP, in Houston, and also served as assistant criminal district attorney in McLennan County. He joined Baylor Law in 2003 and has become well-known or perhaps infamous for his teaching of the Civil Procedures course in Baylor School's Practice Court program. If you don't know Baylor Law, The practice court program is its signature program, and I am told that nobody ever forgets who taught them in practice court. And he has written a book on civil procedure, in focus. He too has won outstanding faculty awards for teaching in 21 and 22. So I am going to hand it off to Jeremy to lead off the discussion with Dave Bridge. Oh, you've already got it.
I'm mic'd up, but thank you, Dr. Brickhouse, and thank you and the president for having this program. And I want to thank Dean Archer for providing us such a lovely venue, and Carl Flynn, my friend Carl Flynn, has done such an incredible job getting this all together. So thanks to all of you. And thanks everybody for coming. This is a really great book, Dave, and it is very, very timely. And I don't think we're going to tiptoe through the tulips. We're gonna run right through them. So it's evocative. You and I have had a chance to talk about your book, which obviously Supreme Court is front and center in the book. And in our prior conversation, you said that you tell your students something about the United States Supreme Court. And when I heard that, what you tell your students, I thought to myself, I am stealing that line and passing it off as my own to my students. Tell them what you tell your students about the United States Supreme Court.
Don't go to Baylor Law, because there's this really mean professor.
It's not necessarily bad advice.
So before I answer, I just would echo the thanks to the Provost, to the libraries. Friends, family, students, former and current are here. Thank you so much for being here. It's very nice of all of you to show. I tell my students that the U.S. Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the history of the world. And it's pretty undeniably so. No other court in the history of the world makes the kind of policy or procedural decisions that the U.S. Supreme Court does, and has that kind of lasting power. So another true statement is the U.S. Constitution is the longest running written constitution in the history of the world. And I don't think you get working written constitutions without courts. And so there are other courts, lower courts as well, that are fundamental to the United States. But the Supreme Court is a symbol of really that the rule of law is the backbone of American constitutionalism. And I'm really proud of Baylor and the Constitution class. It was mentioned earlier. We do things a little differently at Baylor. At most schools, there's an Intro to American Politics class. We have an Intro to the U.S. Constitution class. And so our class is not just on what the United States does, but how and why. And the course doesn't work without courts, and especially without the symbol of, as I say, the most powerful court in the history of the world.
When you said that to me, the most powerful court in the history of the world, I immediately thought, as you just said, that is undeniably true. And why haven't I ever said that to my own students when I'm teaching Supreme Court cases, just to give them a flavor? And so I will be stealing that. I will credit you for it the first 2 times that I do it, and after that, I'm passing it off as my own wisdom. Okay, so we have 3 branches of government. The Supreme Court is the only court mentioned in Article 3. The other federal courts are inferior courts, inferior to the United States Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is, the federal judiciary is different than the other 2 branches. And help us understand how it's different than the other 2 branches.
In every way, right? I mean, so first, they are making policy decisions. It is a little bit of a political institution like the other branches, but the way it goes about its business is completely different. So even the way they dress is different. They wear robes, the way that they sit elevated, the way that they have to defend their decisions. Members of Congress can walk in, vote yay or nay, and walk out. Supreme Court justices have to sometimes literally sign their name to an opinion, and if not sign their name on it, at least agree or sometimes dissent. It's a special institution. So I have some former students out there, and they've heard this story. I think the Supreme Court is really special, and there's something about it, something unique that draws me to it. And I think I found out I was meant to be a political scientist during the election of 2000. I was in high school, and my Provost Brickhouse had just graduated college. I was trying to get access to a TV to watch the Florida Supreme Court rule on the first Bush versus Gore case, and it was televised. And my high school only had 3 TVs, and I knew where one of them was. And I jumped a 7-foot ledge, broke in through a window, got into the room, and this is back in the day when TVs had bunny ears antennas, and it didn't have that. So I grabbed a paper clip and jammed that thing into the coaxial and made my own antenna. And lo and behold, the teacher walks in and says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to watch this." And he said, "Well, you know you're not supposed to be here." And I said, "Yeah, I know." And he said, "Go grab some more paper clips." And so that kind of encouragement really went a long way. But I had to see what was going on in this court, because courts don't do this. Courts don't decide elections. And ultimately, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court did, for better or worse. And I remember thinking, why is this registering so poorly with me? Because courts resolve disputes, not elections. And even if those disputes concern civil rights, civil liberties, governing procedures, it's special what they do. And I remember thinking in 2000, maybe I wanted George W. Bush to win, maybe I wanted Al Gore to win. That's beside the point. But courts are special. And it was that negative case that made me think, we really have something in this country that most don't.
Yeah. The Bush v. Gore decision resonated with me in a slightly different way, because if you'll recall, the result of the decision was that George W. Bush would be the next president of the United States. And Al Gore went on television and he said, "I strongly disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, but I respect it and I concede." It was soaring and majestic, and we didn't have fighting in the streets or anything over it. But to me, it came down to what he said: respect for the institution. So here's the Supreme Court. They decide that, not just in Bush v. Gore, but they make a decision. This statute, this federal statute, passed by Congress, signed into law by the president, all elected representatives, is unconstitutional and shall not be enforced. 5 of 9 decide that that's true, and now it's not the law of the land anymore. Why is that okay? That seems very undemocratic, right? Because 5 people who were not elected to their positions, as few as 5, I should say, who are not elected to their positions get to say, you know what your elected representatives decided about this law? It violates the Constitution of the United States. Why? Well, because we say so. How is that? You say it's important to our constitutional system, but it seems at odds with democracy.
Yeah, you ask a really good question, and you're in very prestigious company in asking that, because just to give you a sense of the range of people who have asked the same question, Barack Obama asked it when he was president, and Donald Trump asked it during his first term. Why should these unelected judges be able to strike down laws that are created by elected officials? That's unconstitutional. That's not representing the will of the people. That's not what this Constitution is about. I think I disagree. I think the court does have the power of judicial review. I don't think that's what the book is about. Yeah. But it's interesting. We think that they're voting against the majority's wishes when they strike down a law, because the law was passed by a majority. Right. But almost every single time that the court strikes down a law, it's actually a very popular ruling. Or when the court makes policy, it's a very popular ruling. Gideon versus Wayne. This case where the Supreme Court said that everybody accused of is it a felony? Accused of a crime, a felony, they're entitled to legal representation. It's considered to be a very activist decision, the court going out of its way and making this grand ruling and ordering the 50 states to do this thing that they never did before. Well, in actuality, 47 of the states were already doing that. There were only 3 states that weren't doing it, and 2 of them were on their way to provide this service. So this is a ruling that actually almost every single American agreed with.
Yeah.
And so there are these clever ways in which actually when the court strikes down a ruling, it's usually pretty popular, the ruling is.
Yeah. And I want to get to that, and I don't want to pull us too far afield, but I think it's important for us to, as citizens, to understand that the Constitution of the United States is making some things not subject to a vote. I mean, for example, we have the right to free exercise of religion no matter what some elected representatives or group of them decide is true. The Constitution has resolved that issue and said, no, you have the right to free exercise. But so I think you're right that it is an important part. The court is an important part of our constitutional order. So I want to get to this, the thing you just touched on. One of the points your book makes is often, perhaps most of the time, the Supreme Court's decisions are popular. Even though your book is focusing on the unpopular decisions, but most of the time they're popular.
Right.
Talk about that.
That they're popular?
Yeah, that they're popular, usually.
Why are they popular would be one question. And that's because, well, first, the justices are chosen by the political process. Right. So people who were elected popularly choose the justices. But also, Supreme Court justices are Americans just like you and me. And they come from the same culture that we do. They're seeing influences that we do. And they're part of the mainstream popular culture that we are all subject to, whether we agree with it or not. But otherwise, one of the underlying assumptions of my work is that there often is a dominant coalition in Washington. And flowing from that, a secondary assumption is that the court is part of that coalition. And maybe not consciously or explicitly, but the court is sometimes charged with doing certain things that the rest of the coalition can't get done. So striking down laws from the old coalition. Mm-hmm. The old guys were just thrown out of power, but their laws are still in place. And so the new coalition charges the Supreme Court with, get rid of those old laws. We don't like those. And we would think, well, but they're striking down laws. But those laws were made 30 years ago, and they're no longer resonant with the American public. And so there are other clever ways in which the court, the ways in which it rules is, I don't want to say it does the bidding of the coalition. That's not fair, because the court is an integral part of it and helps direct the coalition, not just does what the president or Congress wants it to do. But in many ways, court rulings are what are called majoritarian, reflect the will of the majority of Congress, the president, and or the American public.
You touched upon this in your last answer, but if the Supreme Court, I think this is true, is often striking down a law or part of a law, and yet they're ordinarily making a decision that's in line with what's popular in the country and what's popular with the ruling political group at the time. How do you square those things? Because the law they're striking down was part of that part of the electoral process, right? So the folks that the people elected passed this law, and yet most of the time when the Supreme Court strikes down part of that law, it's popular.
Right.
How can those two things be true at the same time?
The best way to talk about it is maybe using an example or two. So at the turn of the century, Congress was passing child labor laws. And in one of these bills, they couldn't get a majority built in Congress to pass the law, even though everybody wanted to pass it. And so they agreed on this really vague language that in one part of the bill just to fuse together a majority in the House of Representatives. And one representative stood and said, this is clearly unconstitutional. We all know this. Why are we including this in the bill? And apparently there was widespread laughter in the House of Representatives because they all knew that that'll just be taken to the Supreme Court. It'll be struck down, but including that phrase enables Congress to get enough votes to pass the bill that they all want anyway. So that's one way, again, in which it really is majoritarian, even though they're striking something down.
Yeah. And the point that's insightful. And then the other point you said is sometimes they're striking down laws that are no longer popular.
Right.
Right. They were maybe at a time, but they're no longer. Okay. So Supreme Court, most of the time, their decisions are, for use of a simple word, popular.
Sure.
But your book is not about that. Your book is about the unpopular decisions and the pushback that can occur in response to those decisions. So talk to us about what is pushback, and maybe give us an example of how that's played out in real life.
Yeah. So pushback is what happens after the decision. So what motivated me is there are always going to be people who are upset at Supreme Court decisions. What happens when the number of people who are upset is larger than the number of people who are happy with the decision? And it's very rare, but also these are some of our biggest cases ever as well. So that's what I wanted to look at. And I developed some criteria for determining whether or not they're popular or unpopular. That's just method stuff that relatively uninteresting, but the pushback. So I found that there's three kinds of pushback, ways in which the political system can respond to the court. It is not the case that the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's it, game over, we never talk about this issue again. The 5 justices have spoken, and they are the oracles, and we move on to another issue. That's not what happens in American politics. It's an iterative process, always going back to the political system, to the people, to institutions. And that was a driving motivation behind looking at pushback. So there's grassroots pushback. People in local communities can express their level of disagreement with the Supreme Court in meaningful ways. I talk about school prayer in the 1960s in the book. So the Supreme Court strikes down school prayer. Children are not allowed to be led in a state-sponsored prayer in public schools in 1961. And a lot of parents are very, very upset at this decision. They think that their children should be praying in school. School boards are upset. They don't like the Supreme Court telling them what to do. And what happens in local communities is nothing changes. Parents send their kids to school, and the teachers say, I know the Supreme Court said we're not going to pray, but we're going to pray anyway. Or they found clever workarounds, so they would say, we're not going to pray, but I would like everybody to close their eyes and bow your head, and I'm going to just read you part of the congressional record right now. And it just so happened to be the prayer that the chaplain read every day. There's moments of silence. So there's pushback at the local level.
We're an ornery bunch.
There's pushback from Congress. So Congress can attack the court, introduce court curbing measures. So this is something that stuns my students every time I tell them. In almost all cases, in appellate cases, Congress determines the court's jurisdiction. Congress gets to say, Supreme Court, you can hear these kinds of cases, but you can't hear these kinds of cases.
That's right.
And so Congress introduces a ton of proposals saying that the Supreme Court cannot hear prayer cases. They try to amend the US Constitution. And it's just the introduction of these bills. They're not actually trying to pass them. They're just introducing them to signal to the Supreme Court, we're unhappy with you. And so part of the book, it looks at this database of every single attack ever lobbed against the court. And it came from an early paper. Actually, my co-author is in the room from that early paper. And he and I, along with a former graduate student, collected all these attacks. And school prayer is the most attacked Supreme Court decision in American history. There are more attacks against school prayer than any other issue. Abortion, campaign finance, desegregation. And Congress does other little things too, and we might think these are silly, but actually they're important signals. They're part of the pushback. So they inscribe the words, "In God we trust," above where the Speaker of the House sits, immediately after the decision. Those words still stand there today. My favorite one is Congress, as part of the federal budget, includes funding for 9 Bibles to be sent, one each, to Supreme Court justices. And this sounds silly, right? But this is a signal to the Supreme Court. We don't like what you're doing. Take the hint before we restrict your jurisdiction, before we refuse to raise your salaries. So grassroots pushback, congressional pushback, and if those don't work, there's what I call electoral pushback. And the American people can vote in ways that signal their displeasure with the court, and hopefully, to the people who vote that way, try to reverse them. And that doesn't happen with school prayer, because the teachers are so effective at keeping prayer in the classroom.
Well, that's a live issue here in Texas right now. There's the 10 Commandments law in front of the legislature and prayer laws. So the school prayer issue remains controversial, but I want to turn our attention to something that isn't controversial: abortion. This is a useful example because you have Roe and then you have Dobbs. So talk about the popularity or unpopularity of those decisions and the pushbacks that we've seen.
Can I start with Roe?
Sure, please.
So in 1973, the Supreme Court hands down Roe, providing guidelines for what legislatures can and can't do with abortion. It's largely perceived as a pro-choice decision. And you get the kinds of pushback I just talked about. So at the grassroots level, some states, they pass abortion restrictions that work within Roe. So things like parental consent, waiting period, informed consent. And these are ways to try to restrict abortion under the Roe regime. Some states say, well, Roe applied to Texas, but it didn't apply to my state, so we're not going to follow Roe. And you might be surprised as to which states did that. Rhode Island and Connecticut, which we would consider to be very, very liberal states today. But they had heavy Catholic populations that were really opposed to Roe at the time. In Congress, they push back, so you get these attacks again, trying to restrict jurisdiction, a human life amendment. They passed the Hyde Amendment, so this is the federal government restricting any funding for abortion. There's a corporation, a U.S. government corporation, the Legal Services Corporation, that provides funding to bring cases on issues where there's no really interest group to test the jurisprudence. And they say the Legal Services Corporation cannot use their money on abortion jurisprudence. So there are these congressional signals that they're unhappy with Roe, and it's a majority of Congress members. Yeah. When you add up Republicans plus Southern Democrats plus Catholic Democrats, that outnumbers liberal Democrats at the time. And it doesn't work enough. The American people see abortion restricted after 1973. So this is very interesting. After 1973, the abortion rate in this country went down after Roe versus Wade. Because all of this pushback was so effective that in some ways it was harder to get an abortion after Roe than before. And so the pushback is effective, but the American people are still unhappy about it. And one of the genius of Reagan really is the building of his coalition. And really it's using Roe versus Wade to attract new voters who for 40 years to that point, New Deal Democrats, they had always voted Democrat. They didn't think about who they were voting. They didn't have to think. They walked into the poll. If it had a D next to their name, they checked it. But the Democratic Party then, Reagan associates it with Roe versus Wade. And he says, we're trying at the grassroots, we're trying in Congress, but the only way to solve the Roe problem is to elect Republicans in 1980. So 1984 rolls around and they haven't overturned Roe. And so the Republican Party again says, we're trying, we're doing all these things that we can, but we still haven't solved the Roe problem. And the only way that we're going to solve this is by electing Republicans. And they do that for 50 years. The book starts out with the line, Roe versus Wade was the gift that kept on giving. Until Dobbs.
Yeah, and the dog caught the car.
The dog caught the car. On the day that Dobbs is issued, there are almost no elected Republicans that either make a statement or that say, this is a great ruling. Almost every single elected Republican is now terrified because in the time from 1973 to 2022, public opinion on abortion changed. Put very simplistically, 2/3 of the country was opposed to Roe versus Wade in 1973, and in 2022, 2/3 of the country supported Roe versus Wade. And so there's this opportunity for the Democratic Party to run an abortion campaign the way the Republican Party ran it for 50 years, to use the issue and its electoral pushback to win elections.
And so Dobbs is 2022, then you have the 2024 election, and the Democrats, using the pushback techniques that the Republicans used, were able to retake the House and take the Senate and win the White House.
So
I might need to check my news feed on my phone, but I don't think that happened, Dave. And so far we might think, well, because of that Dobbs decision being unpopular, the Democrats should have, your book might be read to predict that the Democrats should have had huge electoral success in the succeeding, the upcoming election. Mm-hmm. And they did not,
right, rather
famously. So how do you respond to that? How do you explain that?
So first, thank you very much for the question. I really do appreciate it. This is, the book never hinged on the Democrats winning the election. That's not what political scientists do, and if that's what we did, political scientists wouldn't have a job. But I really do appreciate you asking, well then, why didn't everything you predicted come to fruition at some level? We can debate this. Some folks think that Kamala Harris pushed abortion a lot, Dobbs a lot. I don't think so. I think it should have been the first and last thing she said anytime she spoke to anyone. I think Donald Trump was absolutely masterful in controlling the agenda. So people would ask him questions about abortion, and he'd say things like, well, it's decided now, it's back to the states. The real problem, though, is immigration. Why aren't we talking about immigration? And then all of a sudden we're talking about immigration. Yeah. But the main reason why Dobbs didn't have an effect is, and I don't mean to make light of this, but Democrats fixed the problem. If you fix the problem in politics, you don't get to run campaigns on it. So
how'd they fix the problem? Talk about that.
You got red states actually allowing abortion. So Kansas passes a referendum granting easier access to abortion. If you're in a state that doesn't have abortion, there's probably a state nearby you that does have it. Groups are set up to transport women who need an abortion across state lines. If you need an abortion after Dobbs, in all likelihood, you could probably get one. It might cost you, it might be hard, but you still have that access. And enough people who were upset by the Dobbs decision. So same thing, you have people from after Roe. You have people who have voted Republican all their life, but after Dobbs comes out, for the first time, they're considering, this is a really important issue. I'm worried about women being able to get an abortion now. Maybe I need to start voting Democrat. But once their state allows access to an abortion, they take a sigh of relief, not just because they have access to an abortion, but also they can go back to voting Republican. The clearest example of this, it never actually happened, but there was a group of liberals who wanted to set up a giant steamship in the middle of the Mississippi River between Mississippi and Louisiana that would be an abortion clinic. And so in those states that banned abortion, you would still have access to it because the middle of the Mississippi River is not Louisiana, it's not Mississippi, it's federal land. And so you fix the problem, you can't run on it anymore. And again, this is part of the genius of the Republican Party from 1980 to 2022. They did enough on abortion to restrict it, but never fixed the Roe problem. In 2 years, Democrats fixed the Dobbs problem, and that doesn't allow you to run on it anymore.
Yeah. So the solution to the Dobbs problem doomed the Democrats, is what you're saying?
They were more interested in ensuring women who wanted access to an abortion were able to get it than in winning national elections. And I would argue that's why they lost.
You've talked about also about maybe, the Kansas election that you mentioned, that was one that, the Democrats pointed to, boy, we are going to clean house in 2024 because look at Kansas of all places where we were so successful. But there can be other issues that I would think that overwhelm even what is a wind in the sail of Democrats. I mean, even assuming Dobbs is somewhat of a live issue in the 2024 election, there can be other issues that could overwhelm it. I mean, do you accept that that's true?
Sure.
Like inflation. I mean, we hear so much about inflation and immigration. And
Sure. Just because the Supreme Court makes an unpopular decision and there's a group of Americans who are willing to rethink the way they vote, it doesn't mean it's going to play out that way. So lots of other things happen. The economy, immigration. I think that Democrats actually had another opportunity with student debt. I wonder if Joe Biden signed every student gets $10,000 cut off their debt. I think he signed that into law knowing the court would strike it down so that he could run telling all these young people, I tried to give you $10,000, but the mean old Republican judges took it away from you. If you want that $10,000 back, elect Democrats. And I asked my students, how many of you thought this was unconstitutional, signing this executive order? And a majority raised their hand. And then I asked them, keep your hand up if you don't care if it was unconstitutional. And you know what? I find that $10,000 is a good motivator for votes.
Yeah.
But again, Biden actually moved to fix the problem. He said, well, I'm gonna defer money, or I'm gonna extend your payment cycle. To which people said, oh, that's good enough. And it wasn't a winning issue with young people. So just another example of fixing the problem. But to answer your question, yes, other issues certainly arise.
This may be an unfair question. Are you aware of any Democrats who said, hey, let's not fix the problem? Sort of a very Machiavellian approach to Dobbs? They probably wouldn't tell you that they were doing that, but I don't know if there have been any reports of that. Did they spot the issue that you've spotted, I guess is what I'm asking.
Maybe. I'm sure people high up in the DNC had these conversations. They can't say so in public, right? Yeah. They can't tell their own voters, we know you're worried about getting access to an abortion. Just hold off on that for 50 years. But I'm sure they had the conversation. So one thing we could do is we could say, well, what happens if they don't have time yet to fix the problem? And so that would be the 2022 midterms.
Right.
Where Democrats, everybody agrees, outperformed expectations.
Yeah. This is the red wave election that never materialized.
Yeah. And I think it's because they hadn't fixed the problem yet. People were upset about Dobbs, and they showed up to vote Democrat in 2022.
And just to kind of close the loop on this piece, you published this book in 2024 before the elections, and when you frame the issue, does the pushback to Dobbs necessarily mean that Democrats were successful? And I think you even italicize it, maybe. I hope I'm not misremembering that. But you say unequivocally no. It doesn't mean they're gonna win. You talk about it's an opportunity that they have to take advantage of, and I guess what you're saying is they didn't.
Correct. And these opportunities are very, very rare.
Yeah.
In fact, I would argue the last time it happened was Roe. And the last time it happened before that was probably the New Deal decisions, where FDR was able to go to the people and say, if you don't keep electing Democrats, we're not going to have a New Deal anymore.
So half a century to wait for another opportunity, it seems. Okay, I want to switch gears and move beyond just a little bit, because this is so in the news right now. The D.C. Federal District Court has issued an order to stop deportations of, I think it was some Venezuelan migrants. And now there's a question about whether they had already been sent back in a plane, or if they hadn't been, and the Trump administration ignored the order, and I think the D.C. judge is trying to figure out what the facts are right now. I guess my question is, can there be pushback in reverse? Pushback on a president who is, or an entire administration who's hostile to the court?
Oh, what a great question. Do the lessons in the book apply to other institutions?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I think so. And I think it's, again, because in a system of separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, no one branch controls everything. You never actually win in American politics. You're just better positioned to fight tomorrow. So I don't know if you heard this, but yesterday in a redistricting case at the Supreme Court, Justice Alito was asking a lawyer from Louisiana, well, why are you even following this court decision? If it's egregiously wrong and you think it's bad, do you think it has to be followed? And a lot of liberal commentators see that as Alito saying, you don't have to do it. Do whatever you want. You don't have to listen to courts. I think I read it differently. I think Alito was actually signaling to Trump, saying our decisions have merit, and you're about to hear that they need to be followed. And I think the rest of the political system would push back against a president who, at least repeatedly, maybe on one issue or something, but at least repeatedly doesn't follow court orders. Congress, Congress really respects the court. They introduce all these attacks, thousands of them, purporting to curb the power of the court, but they never pass them. In fact, when they're about to pass, leaders of Congress get together and figure out how to make these bills fail by one vote. To send the signal to the court, we're unhappy with you, but we don't want to restrict your judicial independence. Because it's so essential to what we do as a nation that believes in the rule of law under a written constitution. Even if it's just one court, the symbol of the highest court in the land being followed, a court that doesn't have the power of the sword, the power of the purse, supporting that from branches that do have that authority is essential. And Congress and the president usually do. And so if the Trump administration were to defy a court order, I would expect pushback. I would hope there's pushback. And if it doesn't happen, I would absolutely expect the Democratic Party to try to win elections off of it.
Yeah. Just to circle back to, you started with, you think it's a special court, and you just said it doesn't have the power of the purse, it doesn't have the power of the sword. It really can't enforce its own orders, in other words. And so it's so important that it remain special in obviously the hearts and minds of the American people, and especially in our political leaders, because that's respect is what they have. But I don't know. Those are my thoughts. I don't know if you want to talk more about this, the court being special.
So this is where actually we might bridge the gap, cross the river, let's say, between political science and the law school. We might study the legal or the political aspect of the court. You study jurisprudence, the legal aspect, but there's something about the court. It's both. It's political and it's legal. But the second part of that statement is what makes it different, that it has to rely on others. It has to rely on reason. What other institution is there where different sides give their perspective, are asked almost always very civil questions. They debate, tempers rise, but that's because they're trying to get at the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Most people don't know this either. Most court cases are unanimous.
Yeah.
The 9 justices almost always agree. It's these big issues where they don't. And so they're working together to try to solve these issues. And every day when the justices get together, they start every day, every justice shakes every other justice's hand. They're really working together because they know that the rule of law is not something that can be taken for granted. And that they're an integral part, a necessary part. Not sufficient, but a necessary part of American democracy.
Well said. I think we're going to open it up to questions from everyone else now.
Because we're streaming.
Oh, yes, thank you. A question that's been asked a number of times in some of the things I've heard at the Baylor Law School, some of the programs they've conducted. In the terms of pushback, self-destruction, are some of the justices by their behavior, and I won't repeat all that's happened in terms of RVs and special loans and that kind of thing, are these, and this is to both of you, for you, a professor in political science, is this negating or eroding the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and even the federal judiciary, which I think John Roberts is concerned about now? For you, Dr. Counseller, are you concerned, how has this changed how you teach students at the Baylor Law School? You now help oversee the school. How has that changed what you guys have to do in terms of teaching students how to respond in federal cases? That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to go?
Well, we have never told students you should accept special favors from people who are practicing in four-year court. So, and we would have and continue to say that's not a thing you should do. One of the things they learn is the judicial code of ethics, and so they speak to those issues. It just doesn't touch the United States Supreme Court directly. Yeah.
And Professor, in terms of eroding their own legitimacy, is that a concern or not?
So legitimacy is hard to measure. It's more something you feel. So even if you feel like it's being eroded, that's important. I don't think the American public cares that much about these things. For what it's worth, just a couple days ago, Amy Coney Barrett recused herself from a case. She provided no reason for it. We think it's because one of her best friends is counsel for, or will be arguing before the Supreme Court. So there's still it's still happening that they have an ethics code. Congress can pass an ethics code if they wanted to. The American public gets much more upset if the effects of a decision are really unpopular than if they think the justices themselves aren't behaving by a certain code or something. Americans care about the bottom line.
So I'm curious about your observations, if you have any, as a political scientist. Like you've talked about kind of the tension between Congress and the judicial branch in some cases, but respect also. So I'm curious, like if over time, did one branch become more influential than the other or less? Or maybe it's the like the president, or maybe even like the grassroots, because you talked about this as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. The Supreme Court had a very difficult time establishing its authority at the beginning of the Republic. It took a good 25 years for people to consider them an equal branch. And there's a few cases that really made a big difference. And then we kind of entered, the first part of our history, Congress was really the dominant branch, the first among equals. Starting with the New Deal, coming out of World War II, the presidency seemed to gain more power. And there's an argument now that we are a full-blown presidential system, that the president is the first among equals. It's really hard to say that's not true right now. Nevertheless, there still are three branches. And at the root of everything, the sovereign institution in this country, it's not the president, it's not the Congress, it's not the judiciary, it's not the states, it's the people. So other than like the ancient Greeks, we were the first to ever do that. So if people don't like what's going on, they can always change it.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Bridge. One of the things that stood out to me in the way that you answered the question about Roe is the shift of, 2/3 of America at the beginning didn't support Roe, and now 2/3 do. I'm wondering if you can speak to the potential that the Supreme Court has, even when deciding in unpopular ways and facing pushback, to fundamentally alter public opinion on one of these key issues through the durability of their decisions.
Sure.
Good question.
And your name, please?
Joseph Natali?
Joe is one of my graduate students.
That's a lawyer question. You asked a question you knew the answer to. That's good.
I don't think that the court switched opinion on abortion. I think it was more organic. And in fact, I think opinion from 1973 to 1992, states started doing more pro-life things in the late 80s, early 90s that got a little out of line with public opinion. And in the 1992 case, Casey, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, they actually allow states to start restricting abortion just a little more. And so I think the court was following the organic changing of public opinion on abortion. And Dobbs flies in the face of that, I think.
Hey, Dr. Bridge.
Hi, Luke.
Do you think in the midterm elections coming up and the next presidential elections in 2028, Democrats are going to try to attack Dobbs again to use as leverage for trying to win the midterms in the presidential election?
It's tough to say. I'm not sure the Democratic Party knows what it's doing tomorrow. Every day is a new day for the Democratic Party right now. For the Republican Party too, I think. But maybe, so Joe, maybe there's an answer to the previous question is maybe living under a Dobbs world, some states restrict abortion in a way that the American public finds acceptable, and the issue is no longer as popular for the Democrats as it once was. I don't think Congress is going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. I think we'll have the introduction of bills from super conservative members of Congress who are appealing to their home constituency. But President Trump has said he will veto a national abortion ban. He says it is absolutely up to the states, which that's not what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said it's up to legislatures. So Congress can pass an abortion law, but Trump said he'll veto it. Maybe he's hoping public opinion will change, even if just slightly. I also wonder if the Republican Party will get a little more liberal on abortion, as it already has. So a lot of very far-right pro-life groups are not happy with the Republican Party right now. They're very unhappy with President Trump for saying that he would veto a national abortion ban. They think that no other Republican president would have ever done that, let alone said that they would do that. So maybe Democrats actually shy away from the issue if the court's opinion does change the public opinion in inorganic ways. Thank you.
I get the last question. So I'm going back to my U.S. Constitution course.
Excellent.
One of my big takeaways from that was that I had rights enshrined in the Constitution that the majority could not take away from me. And so I was reading your book and thinking, I'm just too idealistic. I mean, the Supreme Court justices are swayed by public opinion like everybody else is. They're just human beings. So how do I straddle this ground between what I think is a normative ideal of the institution? And by the way, as people of faith, we should care a lot about minority rights. And they are enshrined in the Constitution, but am I hopelessly idealistic to think that the courts will protect minority rights?
Absolutely not. Thank you for the question. When I teach judicial review, so when the idea that the court can strike down laws is unconstitutional, I say that this is an essential feature of the US Constitution. Because what other institution is going to protect minority rights? It's not going to be Congress. They have to win elections. It's not going to be the president. They have to win elections. It's not going to be the states. They have to win their own elections. Or politicians in the states have. So what other institution will do it? It has to be the court. And you might be thinking, well, but court decisions don't always go my way. I don't like some of them, and it feels like some of my rights or liberties are being taken away, and the court's not there to protect them. But we live in a country where 51% of the population cannot brutally oppress the other 49%. Sometimes you lose a court case. That's okay. And even if it's on a really big issue, that's okay. Because we also do have to have majoritarian rule. We have minority rights and majority rule. That's the beauty of American politics in a way that almost no other civil society or constitution has ever been able to balance those two. Sometimes the balance gets out of whack, but almost always we have both. And that doesn't happen without the Supreme Court.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation. Please join me in thanking
Thanks so much, Sharon.
That's great. That was great.
We do have books in the back if you'd like a book. I'm sure you can even get a signed book. And we have more coffee and more cookies. Please join us for conversation. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.